what is that exposure that this new, sort of era is bringing with us? So on the continent, we can really think about skipping sort of these traditional BPO models that some companies have already set up here, but really thinking through how do you build AI native service industries that also deploy agents for global clients? And how do you sort of level up remote work and really become, the global service opportunity for the world? How do you leverage African talent to really position to manage these intelligence systems at scale? And I think this is really where there's a huge opportunity for the continent. In terms of models and development, we're seeing that reasoning models are evolving, and the end of syntax is here. So for everyone who is or used to be or still prides themselves at being a developer, your skills are sort of, going out of the window a little bit, right? Even though obviously the experience isn't, but the skills at large are, and the hottest new programming language is English. So everybody can now build an app, right? And what we're seeing is AI is really moving towards reasoning first, right? And you have a lot of, when you use models like ChatGPT, you use models like Manus, you see that, it says that it's thinking, right? So this is where it's no longer prediction, but it's actually reasoning, and it's making decisions based on different things that it's learned. It's making, decisions based on different patterns. And the outcome really is that it is able to now create properly, right? And that means that especially software development is really being shaken up in terms of just it changing completely. So we're witnessing really a fundamental decoupling of software creation from coding skills to just being able to describe what you want, right? And being able to say, oh no, add another button here and do this and do that. And we're also seeing that software is becoming more and more disposable. So when the cost of code really is dropping to almost zero because anyone can code. And, the other day, one of the labs published that I think it was Claude, did the work of an entire dev team that took the dev team 1 year. Claude did that work in an hour. Now, if you can disrupt to that level, it means that, you're really driving the cost down. And it means that you can build apps for single use, right? You want to do a presentation in a meeting and you want to show something, you build, an app. We're seeing people, building things for themselves. You want to manage, your stock portfolio without having to pay for a subscription. You can set up a little cute app using vibe coding. So the architect era is here, right? So what we're seeing is that system design is becoming more and more important than actual syntax. And for Africa, I think the opportunity really lies in, saying, okay, we thought we needed to train developers. Now we know we don't need to do that, but we need problem solvers. We need to really train people who understand and can use these type of reasoning models to actually help other people solve problems, who can help people, sort of figure it out and help them build the next generation of software. In terms of local solutions and global speed, I think what we're going to see is that there's going to be more and more need for, sort of hyper-local solutions, for example, for informal markets, right? Without really needing that kind of big engineering team. And I think that's really a big advantage, where real problem solvers and real innovators can go out there without having to raise millions of dollars, without having to, sort of really invest in resources, and they can build solutions. And I think that's really the beauty of the age of AI. And that's what we really saw a lot of in 2025. We also saw, in terms of corporate adoption, that there's really a really big integration gap. So when you look at the numbers, almost 70% of enterprises have adopted some level of a pilot, but only 31% are able to really successfully scale these pilots at enterprise level, right? And what we're seeing is that, and there was this whole information around, oh, does that mean that coding is or AI is not really working, and it's just a big bubble, and it's not for enterprise. But I think we wrote a blog post about that earlier in the year, and we sort of unveiled and sort of demystified that entire kind of allegation. And it really boils down to enterprise not really being ready for transformation, for real transformation. A lot of the time, there's lack of data readiness, there are big governance gaps, there's lack of internal capability, cultural readiness isn't there, where even teams and employees are not really aligned with what the vision of the organization is. And we're also seeing that leadership buy-in, as well as the knowledge base that leaders actually have, is really, really thin. So if you say we have 10,000 users with access to AI, but 0 new business models, then you're just doing the same old thing slightly faster, right? And that's what most organizations are doing. So there's a big change management bottleneck. There's a lot of shadow AI, which basically means that employees are bypassing the tools that have been provided, if there are any tools that have been provided, and they use their own tools to create and with that, they create actual big leakage risks and governance blind spots. And what we're also seeing is that you're spending a lot more time trying to optimize prompts, trying to quality control, trying to test tools, than to actually, sort of use that time that you're saving to do something new and create new value. Now, I think in terms of what is the strategic advantage for the continent, it's really around agile first startups. So African startups often have less legacy processes, less legacy software, less legacy infrastructure than Western giants. And that allows them to integrate AI into core workflows much, much faster. And I think this is something that, as African organizations, we really need to leverage. And we also need to think about, how do we not get tied into, enterprise software where maybe we can use AI to actually build some custom solutions. Then there's obviously the opportunity of really shifting our mindset and teaching our teams to really reimagine our entire processes and organizations, and not just operate new software. And what we're seeing a lot of the time when we talk to, potential clients, a lot of them, are like, what AI should I get, right? But if you treat AI like a shopping list, and you treat AI like you're buying software, you're going to fall exactly into this trap where you are not going to be able to scale, and where you're just testing things, but not actually unlocking any value. The sixth trend is around cybersecurity and governance. And this is really where we saw a lot of turbulence in 2025. We saw that there's a trade-off between speed and security. So Google's anti-gravity was launched, and it was compromised within 24 hours. We also saw that Claude got hacked, and we had a lot of assumptions around, these big safety first labs and models being very, very safe. But we realized that AI is now actually infiltrating AI, right? We're also seeing sort of the agents wars beginning. And I think that this will taper out in 2026, but I'll talk to that a little bit later, where you have lawsuits from Amazon saying Perplexity should not use their AI browser to actually browse their products, because what the browser was doing was basically outsmarting the system and getting really, really cheap deals, because it understood what the algorithm of Amazon was doing. We've also seen regulation coming out in terms of the EU AI Act. This is regulation that has global impact, because if you're non-compliant, it can penalize you up to 7% of your global revenue. We also saw deregulation in the US specifically, where competitiveness is put first. And that is basically before safety, before ethics, and I think that that's really something to really watch and to look out for. Safety is no longer theoretical, right? We're seeing really high profile failures. We're seeing a lot of legal challenges. And I think in 2026, the lawyers will have a field day with a lot of, legal cases. At the same time, cybersecurity is also really shifting from defending static systems to really managing these AI-driven environments. And that means that you now have autonomous threat surfaces, right? You're turning security into AI versus AI. And that, is something that's really interesting, and I think we'll see a little bit more of that as we go on. So the era of move fast and break things, and sort of fail fast, is colliding with the reality of move fast and get sued or get hacked. And I think that's something for everybody to sort of learn from and really think about. We're also seeing that there is, sort of a systemic risk in terms of, sort of vendor concentration. There's a small number of AI providers. That means that a single breach can actually impact a lot. And we saw that with the Claude hack, where there were multiple exploits of data across multiple industries of enterprise Claude subscriptions. Cybersecurity, like I said, is now AI versus AI, and shadow AI is really, I think, where a lot of that exposure can also come from, because you don't know what your employees are actually using. In terms of Africa's strategic advantage, it's really about being very pragmatic around governance. Africa has a really unique opportunity to set a distinct AI regulatory pathway that avoids overregulation and underregulation. So I think somewhere in the middle of the EU AI Act and the US deregulation. And I also think that we can really think through how we can, sort of have a cyber resilience first type of mindset, and also build our AI with that in mind, as we learn from the lessons of people who have, sort of already gone before us and who have walked that journey. Now, the seventh trend is around geopolitics and the regulatory reality. And what we're really seeing is that there are sort of three competing visions for the future of AI. There's the US model that is really focused on private scale. It's focused on, sort of economic value. It's focused on the sheer power of compute. Then there's the Chinese model, which is state-driven, state-funded. It has a lot of hardware constraints, obviously, because American chip makers are not selling to the Chinese. But because of that, they've become really, really inventive. I always say that if you don't have a lot of money or resources, you'll find the poor man's way of doing things. And that's what they've done. And you can see, models like DeepSeek are able to really run much more efficiently than the American models, and also on much less funding. And then there's that sovereign model where data regulation and data residency comes into play. And that's really what we're seeing in the EU and the Middle East, where there are much lower numbers. So in Germany, for example, they put $20 million aside to build their own large language model. And everybody laughed, because here are all these American startups that are using tens of billions of dollars to build their own models. And then here you come with a meagerly $20 million. Now, the question is, how do you compete with that, right? On a continent where we have massive infrastructure issues, and we have really big, troubles and things to really think about. But I think we just really need to make sure that we also, first of all, figure out how do we really navigate this, market that is not unified, and where, sort of like that sort of single global AI market is not really on the cards, and really thinking through how do you, ensure that you have sovereignty around your AI, not just in your models, but also in your laws. So there is the geopolitical fragmentation that we're seeing, right? Where even as an organization, if you are a global organization, or you have a lot of global partners, you really need to think through, what is your strategy for the West? What is your strategy for Asia? What is your strategy for the global South? We're also seeing that, just like we saw with GDPR, the EU's rules are becoming sort of the de facto global standard, right? And a lot of companies and countries have actually started adopting the EU AI Act into their own laws. In terms of the African strategic advantage, we're really seeing sort of this digital non-alignment, where I think Africa can gain from leveraging US scale, Chinese hardware efficiency, and European open weights models, right? And really building our own hybrid ecosystem, right? So the question is, how do we do that? And how do we also leverage the African Free Trade Agreement to do that? How do we bring our collective power, funds, and infrastructure together to actually win the era of AI? Regulatory leapfrogging, I think this is also where we can sort of focus on innovation-first policies that really avoid this heavy-handedness of what the EU has, and where we're able to potentially attract AI and R&D labs that are global to actually come and do some of their research here. And I think we need to continue to push for data localization. And when you look at a lot of the regulators, they are already, sort of pushing for that, where your data is not allowed to actually leave your shores, which means that you have to have local data centers, which will, sort of then also attract investment. So it's really to think through all of that, from a regulatory and policy perspective. And with that, we're going to, okay, I'm missing one trend. I'm just going to speak to that, very quickly. But the age trend basically focuses on trust deficit. And the trust deficit really is around, there's more and more content that is being created. And that content is content that anyone can create, right? So videos, you can make a video of Nkem with, this exact background, but Nkem saying something completely different, right? Advertising toothpaste or something. And those type of videos that are deepfakes or just content that is, considered as brain rot or slop, is becoming more and more. And it's becoming much and much harder to actually differentiate between AI-made videos and real videos. And I think the models in 2025 have actually become much, much better. And, that really also tells us that this trust deficit is going to continue to grow, and there's going to continue to be more content out there that we don't know whether it's real or not. And that really leads to us really having to think through, how do you actually manage this, right? As there's more, because AI can also create content at the speed of light, right? Which means that you can, create much more fake news, you can create false narratives, you can, do some really, really dangerous things, using AI, and especially with autonomous AI, where the AI is actually creating, content by itself, it becomes more and more dangerous. Now, the opportunity for the African continent really lies around, how do you leverage that, right? How do you create an army of people who help add that human in the loop, right? Who are the verifiers, who can help you say, this is real, this is not real, right? And I think that's really where a really big portion of the sort of ethics conversation, focuses around. Now, we'll go into the predictions for 2026 now that we've had a good sort of understanding of all the things that really shaped 2025. And the predictions, I've sort of grouped them as well. So they're a bit multifold and a bit layered. The first one is really around technology and infrastructure. So this is around compute becoming more of a commodity and being, sort of almost traded the way that it's going to be, oil has always been traded. Also where we're seeing inference first architectures becoming the default, because most enterprise AI budgets, will kind of shift from model training to actual runtime optimization, and really making sure that you save money there. We're also seeing that edge-based, or we will see that edge-based systems will outperform cloud-only models. And I think that we're also going to see that the energy constraints that we are seeing through AI infrastructure demands will, really constrain national energy availability. And I think that's something that a lot of countries have to really think through. Now, the strategic imperative for the continent here really is around secure energy before compute. We're already energy poor. So how do we make sure that we use green energy to actually be able to scale power first, before we, sort of think about chips and models, right? So I think readiness also includes power and where that's going to come from. I think also sort of building inference-led and edge-first infrastructure, right? So this is really where we need to sort of prioritize systems that really focus on cost efficiency, resilience, as well as systems that are just, run much faster and much smarter than what we're seeing out there. And I think there's some new models, like the new DeepSeek model that just came out. The paper was published this week, that doesn't use GPUs and is just trained in a different way, that actually is something that we will be able to, sort of really leverage as a continent. In terms of business and operations, I think that we're going to see more agent-centric operations where enterprises will really redesign core operating models around AI agents and really eliminate entire layers of human coordination. I think we're also going to see more agent-to-agent commerce. So Perplexity being sued by Amazon, I think, will be a thing of the past in 2026, and there will be standards that will be, developed around that, and new algorithms that will, also come to pass. I think we're going to see a lot more proprietary AI-engineered software that will replace generic SaaS software. And I think that AI initiatives that can't demonstrate measurable financial impact within probably 12 months will, be defunded very, very quickly by boards. So I think there's going to be, sort of cutting and slicing of ROI or ROI poor projects very quickly. So for us as a continent, I think we can, sort of skip that, investing in SaaS and also leverage the fact that we don't have that much legacy software and really start building agent-based operating systems that allow us to, operate much smarter and faster very quickly. And I think also we can use agent-to-agent commerce to really formalize the informal sector. And I think this would be really interesting for small traders that can then sort of digitally negotiate with, large suppliers and, sort of get a lot more value from that because it's agents that are now doing the negotiation and the buying for them. In terms of talent and labor, I think we're going to really see a supervisor era and a skill shift where we already see this junior cliff where entry-level roles are declining faster than we're actually, sort of creating senior roles for them. So there's that structural talent pipeline crisis. And I think we're going to see the real impact of that in 2026. I think there will also be new high-value jobs that will emerge that are really focused on supervising, aligning, and intervening AI-driven decision systems rather than executing tasks, right? And I think credentials will become less and less important. I was speaking to my mom earlier today, and we were talking about my son, who is 10 at the moment, and she was like, oh, when he goes to university. And I said, I don't know whether there will be universities in the next 10 years. And she was like, well, but I said, no, what will they learn there? Everything will be AI driven. It will be agents doing the work, right? And that new world order, I think, is something that we really need to think about. I also think that there will be some kind of income stabilization where, governments and large employers will really begin piloting, those type of mechanism in terms of universal basic income. And, I think we'll see the beginning of that. So in terms of our strategic imperative, I think there's a lot for us to leverage and sort of really be fast in ramping up youth employment by making sure that we position for human in the loop jobs and roles. But I think that's just, sort of a jobs first approach. If you really want to, be strategic, you need to build capability, right? And that, I think, requires policy-led skills pathways that really elevate, sort of talent into that higher value AI orchestration, really builds out domain specialists and also assurance roles over time. So I think we really need to make sure that we are, positioning for creating or grabbing a lot of the jobs that are going to be available by also being able to support this new AI economy through the right type of talent, and then sort of build more specialized capability. But we have to be very, very strategic about it. And I think we need to make sure that we also think about capability over credentials. And I know certificates on paper is really important in most African countries, but I think it's going to lose its edge. And as employers of labor, I think it's really important to, sort of really think through how we can approach that in a smart way. The fourth prediction is around reasoning and intelligence. And I think here we're going to see reasoning over scale, and we're also going to see some type of interface shift. So what does that mean? We're seeing more of these reasoning-centric models, and I think they're going to start outperforming the larger models in enterprise decision environments, right? So really shifting away from how much can the model do to how good is the model. I think we're also going to see the first 1 billion user interface. I think we're also going to see that there's going to be more ecosystem lock-ins from big tech specifically, where once you're in with one provider, it will be very difficult to actually move to another. And we're also, I think, going to see commercial influence, including advertising and nudging, that will be within the AI reasoning layers rather than surrounding them, right? So our conventional ads, I think, are going to be embedded into the content that we get back from our agents, from our chatbots that we're using. And I think that's going to be really interesting to sort of see how we navigate that, because we're obviously hardwired in a different way. In terms of our African strategic imperative, I think there's, sort of us thinking through reasoning-based AI and the opportunity that that creates to lead in complex resource optimization, really thinking through how do we improve logistics with that, agriculture planning, energy distribution, and where are the constraints and trade-offs that, sort of predictive models have, and how do we, use agents to really leapfrog those sectors that are sort of, I guess, underfunded, underutilized, and so that they can also start contributing to our economies. I also think that we're going to see more and more voice-first inclusion, where there are a lot of, especially on the continent, a lot of non-English speakers, a lot of people who can't read and write, but they can speak a language, right? And I think that sort of bypassing text-heavy user interfaces and going to speech-focused interfaces is going to be an opportunity for us. And we're already seeing some organizations like Indigenous who are actually championing this on the continent. The fifth prediction is around market dynamics and business models. I think there's going to be a race between Microsoft and Google to become the first $4 trillion company. I think we're also going to see the first one-man $1 million business. I think we're going to continue to see big tech acquiring specialized, especially agent labs. And I think we're going to see a lot of IPOs. There've already been some, whispers around OpenAI and SpaceX IPOs, and I think we're going to see a couple of more. So that will be very interesting as well. So I think on the continent, we really need to think through how to activate corporate venture capital to fund acquiring local AI startups so that we can secure them and actually keep them here. And I think we also need to think about it from a policy and legal perspective, how to do that. And then we need to think about how do we create dominance in niche markets and become vertical AI champions across agriculture, health, fintech, and solving really specific African problems, because I think that those will always be overlooked, and I think that's where the real big opportunities will lie. In terms of the sixth prediction is around exposure and liability. verification. And this is really around attack surfaces are going to be exponentially bigger. Shadow AI risk is going to explode. Legal challenges will be through the roof. This trust deficit that I spoke about is going to continue to grow. So we need to make sure that we build really, policies and strategies around how to secure our data and data residency. We also need to really think through the roles of banks and telcos and the opportunity of them becoming a verification layer in the AI economy and really authenticating digital identities, transactions in a world where deepfakes are, sort of becoming very normal. So even for businesses within those spaces, it's really to think through your role and how you can position differently. In terms of geopolitics, I think there's going to be more fragmentation from a regulatory perspective. I think we're going to see a lot more nations demanding domestic AI infrastructure and sort of sovereign AI clouds. I think sort of that China-US lag is going to shrink. I actually think that we don't know enough about what the Chinese are doing to really say that there is that lag. But I think that we're going to see them overtaking the West this year. I think also we're going to see the first experimental data centers in space. In terms of what Africans can position for, I think this is really where enterprise leaders have to adapt the multi-vendor strategy. Don't get locked in, make sure your technology stack is resilient, make sure that you understand geopolitical risk in a way and trade wars in a way that allows you to still operate in an autonomous manner. Green compute investment. So we've talked about that before, right? Making sure that we actually invest into green energy that can power compute specifically, so that when we do build our data centers, we're not looking for diesel and other power sources. And the last prediction really is around leadership, culture, and governance. I think we're going to see more chief AI officers, and I think that role is going to evolve really from being a technical advisor to a really core strategic executive that has P&L responsibilities as well. I think we're going to see a shift from digital transformation to an AI native culture where AI is embedded in every single workflow. And I also think we're going to see more boards having to really think through how do you oversee these AI algorithms, right? How do you oversee the decisions? How do you ensure fairness? How do you ensure transparency? How do you also set limits when you have agents negotiating with agents? How much money can they spend, right? What kind of contracts can they sign? All of those things are going to become your responsibility as board members, as well as executives. And then I think we're going to see that the speed of innovation becomes sort of the primary metric that we measure, and that we measure against, sort of tracking organizational health and competitive advantage. Now, Africa's strategic imperative here really is board level AI governance. I think we have to establish, sort of committees that are specific to tracking AI risk and managing AI strategy. And I think we're going to see that the CEOs have to become the sort of chief transformation officers, and they need to be in the driver's seat of this AI transformation in order to land their organizations in the right place. Now, when it comes to leadership shifts, I think we will see sort of that organizations can no longer just adopt AI. They really have to be, they have to run AI, right? And in it and be part of it, right? And they have to really think through technology from, looking at AI as just a technology to how is it going to impact the operational model, and how do you, go from it being supporting your decisions to decision delegation, right? How do you make it autonomously and automatically allow it to make decisions for you by defining boundaries and so on. So how do you also move from linear competition to compounding advantage and from isolated oversight to enterprise governance? And what does this mean in practice, right? I think we're seeing more governing decisions, risk ownership, and accountability in an AI-powered organization that go to the board. And for management, I think it will really focus on, you need to reinvent your entire organization, your controls, your leadership roles, your entire organizational structure. You now have AI agents that are going to be part of your workforce. How do you track them? Who supervises them? All of those things are going to become things that you need to think about as leaders. And board accountability and leadership accountability is definitely going to, sort of really expand here. I think we're going to see it expand across the operating model and decision governance, around infrastructure and dependency stewardship, talent and capability continuity, right? So how do you redesign the workforce pipelines for as entry level, getting automated out? How are you solving for that, right? To bring them in as mid-level, even though they haven't done entry level. So all of those things, in addition to, sort of this autonomous market and conduct where you have governing AI-led pricing models, procurement, negotiation, all of those things, really thinking through how do you do that? And how do you also make sure that you're ensuring that, your AI, whether it's in action or a delay, does not, sort of translate into sort of permanent competitive disadvantage, right? So how do you make sure that you're moving in the right direction? Because a lot of people are afraid to move too fast. A lot of people are afraid to move too slow. So you need to sort of find that middle ground. And in 2026, I think leadership has to really think through these things, governing AI decisions as leadership decisions. So AI becomes sort of the main force. Redesigning decisions rights of humans and machines. What decisions do humans take? What decisions do machines take? Build for portability and strategic exits. So how do you, sort of set up these workflows and your systems and your data so that you can move across vendors? And how do you set non-negotiable ethical boundaries, institutional AI literacy at the top as well? So how do you make sure that your board, and your executive leadership understands AI, enough to actually make these decisions? Because you now have these new roles, but you have also new knowledge. So the bottom line really is, that leading in AI means that it's no longer about oversight alone. It's about deliberately designing how power, judgment, and accountability flow between humans and machines. And with that, I am going to hand over to Jola to take us into the panel discussion. Jola, over to you.
Well done, and thank you, Nkem. That was really power-packed and definitely insight-rich. And so with that, we're just going to go straight into the panel conversation. We have an incredible lineup of speakers here today who are going to be talking a little bit more about some of the things that Nkem already spoke about. And I'll be inviting all of them to the stage, one after the other. First is Dr. Ego Obi, who is the Chief AI Officer at AI District and a digital transformation strategist with over 25 years of global leadership. After 2 decades at Google, leading large-scale transformations across international markets, she now advises boards and C-suites on embedding human-centered responsible AI, bridging ethics, trust, and technology. She also serves on the UK House of Lords Information and Digital Board. Welcome, Dr. Ego. You're on mute, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you, Jola.
Thank you for joining us. Next, I'll be inviting Titi Akisomi. Titi is a thought leader in technology, public and product policy, with deep global experience shaping responsible innovation. As Google's global AI policy team lead, she spearheaded responsible policy development for Gemini and has worked extensively on privacy, data governance, and internet policy. She is a Beckham-Klein Fellow at Harvard Law School and advises across institutions on harnessing digital opportunities while managing risks. Thank you for joining us, Titi.
Thank you so much, Jola. I'm really excited to be here. Hello, everyone.
Next is Eugene Okwodu. Eugene is the founder and CEO of Praxon and an AI security architect focused on building resilient, trustworthy digital ecosystem. His work spans securing critical infrastructure and private sector organizations with a strong focus on financial services and legal. He advises executive and boards on AI governance and risk, covering model threat modeling, data protection, and secure ML ops, so teams can innovate quickly without sacrificing trust. Thank you for joining us today, Eugene.
Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here.
Next is Ikezi Kamano, who is also, I would like to introduce Ikezi as also a co-founder of AI Collab, first and foremost. But Ikezi is an AI and product leader with a decade of experience across Meta, Google, and Adobe, combining engineering depth with product strategy and founder-level execution. He supports executive teams in translating generative AI and agent capability into reliable, scalable products, aligning technology choices to customer outcomes and measurable business impact. He's also a two-time founder and a respected voice in responsible AI productization. Welcome, Ikezi.
Thank you, Jola. Very excited to be here. Hello, everyone.
And last but definitely not the least is Ehia Ehabo, who is a transformation leader and board advisor with over 20 years experience across fintech, payments, and financial services. As former EVP Operations and Technology at InterSwitch and co-founder of AI Nigeria, he helps organizations convert AI strategy into delivery, aligning operating models, stakeholders, and change programs for measurable outcomes. He's also a PhD researcher at the University of Bradford, focused on AI-enabled digital transformation. Welcome to the stage, here.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jola. Good day, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I'm actually going to start with you here. So let's get into the depth of this. We had such a rich conversation, so many trends and predictions that Nkem has shared. And we're all, focused on emerging markets, focused on the African continent, focused on Nigeria, some as well. So in emerging markets, we know that constraints are real. Capital, data, quality, and infrastructure, there are lots of constraints around that. Given this reality, what does AI transformation in Africa businesses need to look fundamentally different from Silicon Valley playbooks? So how can we make this happen?
Yeah. So thanks a lot, Jola. And I think that's a very valid point. Context is critical, as with many things. There are quite a number of AI frameworks, digital transformation frameworks around the world. Yeah, but I think one of the things that makes any of these successful is considering context. And many of these frameworks do have some very basic assumptions, which when you then consider the various contexts that are involved, you will then realize why certain assumptions may not hold true for quite a number of geographies. So when you consider Africa, for instance, another emerging market, you will see contexts that are totally different from what you will find in places like Silicon Valley and the rest of the Western world. So I think as leaders in emerging markets and in Africa specifically, as you try to adopt AI, the first good you will do for yourself is just to realize and understand what is my context. I think that's critically important. And context, not just from the perspective of geographies, but even from the perspective of your industry. Through the work that we do, we've seen quite a lot of differences in the maturity level of different industries. As an example, if you read our AI landscape, our annual AI landscape report, where we take a deep dive into the maturity of different sectors, you will find out that, for instance, in Nigeria, financial services maturity from an AI readiness perspective, it's significantly higher than many of the other sectors in Nigeria. So even when you want to deploy some of these frameworks, you need to be aware of the context of your industry, the maturity of your industry. So the first point I'll start with is to say perhaps you want to start with assessment, a readiness assessment, an AI readiness assessment. Help you understand your gaps and then help you then address some of those gaps that you will find. But speaking specifically, though I know that in her keynote, she's also tried to provide a lot of very contextual information for what leaders in Africa can do. I'd like to speak specifically to the AI tripod and some recommendations on what leaders in Africa could possibly do. So we say the AI tripod is data, compute, and talent. For AI transformation to be successful, you need to get these three elements right: data, compute, and talent. From a data and compute perspective, my recommendation would be to focus on what you have versus what you don't have. I see something very common amongst companies within Africa, for instance, where they get themselves into what I refer to as the data myth, where everybody says to themselves, we don't have enough data, we don't have data to do what we want to do. I would strongly recommend that you start with what you have. There are basic things you have that are right. There are narrow data sets that could give you so much value. For instance, a bank. I'm sure most banks will tell you that they can vouch for the credibility and the integrity of their bank statements. Embedded in your statement are lots of data about the customer that you can use to actually train AI models, and it will give you deep value instead of focusing on what you don't have. So as you try to get everything right, you may want to focus on narrow data sets that gives value that you can begin to derive all of the value from. I would also say that there are opportunities for companies within Africa, instead of trying to sort of engage in projects to build very large language models. There is now the concept of federated AI. There is the concept of domain-specific language models, which are smaller models but may give you a lot of immediate real value. So I think those are opportunities. And then finally, from a talent perspective, you want to consider focusing on getting some real deep knowledge and experience for some of your talent, instead of targeting widespread AI knowledge, which many times employees can actually get for themselves. And in many cases, many employees are way ahead of their organizations. So instead of, and for governments as well, I see a lot of governments saying they want to provide AI training to just 1 second. They want to provide AI training to 3 million talents. Yeah, but sometimes the question is it AI literacy that will give you the real value, or building deep, real AI skills? So I think those are some of the things you should consider as you try to build your talent. Yes, there is a case to provide literacy for everybody, but there are many cheap and free resources through which you could do that. You could begin to then focus on the real skills that you want to build within the organization that will move the needle. Overall, resources are constrained, especially in emerging markets. And with resource constraints, you need to just think of where exactly are we putting the resources that we have that will give us immediate value, even in the AI projects that we pick. You don't want to focus on doing too many things. Start with the question, what is the real immediate and biggest impact that AI would have for us? And for some people, it could be in generating more revenue, or in reducing costs, or helping with compliance. So just identify any of those areas and try to focus, as against putting your hands into too many things, and then you are burning cash, burning resources, because AI could burn cash really very quickly if you don't get it right. I'll take a pause here.
Thank you so much for that here. So I think starting with what you have would never go out of fashion. And you really made a great point there in terms of like what already exists and how then can you leverage that and start. But also beyond that, what is your key, like what are your key use cases and how do you prioritize that and build around, key priorities rather than just going around and building so many solutions and just burning cash that really does not exist in our market. Thank you so much for that contribution. we're going to move a little bit more into the customer-facing side. And this question will go to you, Dr. Ego. So thinking about as AI becomes embedded in customer-facing products and core workflows, what are the non-negotiable design principles leaders should insist on to ensure AI systems are safe, secure, and trustworthy for customers and resilient for the business itself?
Thanks, Jola, for the question. So for me, I would say a number of principles actually guide the design, development, design and use of deployment, and use of AI. However, though, I would focus on four principles which are non-negotiable, especially considering the African market realities. So Nkem touched on some of those, and Ehia just touched on one or two of them. So one of them being our reality is the infrastructure gaps that we have. We have trust deficits. We have regulatory asymmetry, as well as, some of the constrained resources, right? There are others. But the first principle that I would really highlight is accountability by design. So as we know, most AI systems are either designed by third-party providers, or they're imported from global vendors, like systems that we use today. They're built by third parties or imported from global vendors. And often the local users of these technologies, they don't often know who to hold accountable if anything goes wrong. So if a system makes a decision, for example, who's accountable? And, as you know, a common term that we're familiar with from Google is whose throat do you choke, right? So leaders must really insist on clear escalation paths so they understand in the workflow who's responsible, who are the owners of each area, right? And then most importantly, when we think about accountability, I would say a human in the loop for high risk decisions, right? The reason why this is important is the leaders of these organizations, if there's any unintended consequences from the use of these technologies or these AI systems, they would have to own that. So accountability is one. And then the second principle, I would say that's really non-negotiable, is transparency and explainability. So if we put that simply, if you can't explain it, then you shouldn't automate it. And I think that kind of aligns with what Ehia said earlier on, which is, start where you are, start small with what you have. And your knowledge of your existing system actually puts you, or your workflows puts you in a solid position, right? So you have to be able to explain, the outcomes of your systems. And why I would say this matters in the African context is many of our users or many of our customers are first-time digital users, right? That's the first. And then they're also operating in low trust environments, right? So where a system makes a decision and nobody can explain why, I think it erodes the trust in the entire digital ecosystem, right? So the third one, coming back to that second point, actually, I'd say leaders must then insist that people know when AI is involved in that, in the decisions that are being made or in their interaction with the systems. And then the decisions that are made can be explained in plain language. The third one, and I think this is touched on, Nkem touched on this heavily in the keynote, is around safety, security, and risk controls, right? So why this actually matters for us in the African context is our data quality is uneven, and then identity systems are still evolving in some parts of the emerging markets, their identity systems, and some are actually in the process of implementing them. Our cybersecurity maturity, it varies widely, right? And there's the impact of errors, often much more severe for vulnerable populations, right? So leaders really need to ensure that they focus on fairness testing on local data, for example, or bias, and then protection against data leaks and abuse. And this is more prevalent, actually, especially where there's heavy use of shadow AI. And Nkem actually talked about that earlier, and the imminent risk that goes with that. And this is where, users within an organization are actually using AI technologies not known or approved by their organization. So, having in the design, ensuring that we are very aware of security and safety and risk controls. I think that's really important. And lastly, I would say a human-centered design and oversight. AI should really support our judgment as humans and not replace the responsibility. So leaders would need to insist on human override, proportional automation, and extra safeguards, especially in high impact sectors such as financial services. So coming back, if we kind of pull this together in 2026, I would say, especially in the African market, I think the real differentiator won't just be how intelligent our AI system is. I think it will be how trustworthy it is, how governable it is, and how resilient it is really in real conditions that people actually live in, rather than arbitrary use cases.
Thank you so much for that. And there's one quote that is going to stick with me, Dr. Ego, and that is, if you can't explain it, you have no business automating it. So I think, there's so many nuggets being dropped here today. I'm taking my notes, so I hope everyone on the call is taking their notes as well. We're going to move a little bit away from the customer or the consumer side to the government side of things. And I'm going to be asking Titi around, just some questions around, AI policy. So Titi, governments are taking a very different approach to AI policy around the world. Some are moving to actively enabling AI innovation, or actually just letting it go and just allowing the innovation to go on its own wings, while others are tightening controls in response to risk. What is the smartest way to design AI systems so they remain compliant in fast-changing regulatory environments while still enabling innovation?
Thank you, Jola, and to Ehit and Nkem and to Ego, who have spoken before me. Thank you for laying a really solid foundation. The first thing, Jola, to all our listeners, is a question mark. Is there a smartest way to be able to address it? When I teach on technology policy or AI policy, I always quote and I say there's nothing new under the sun. The very moment you think you've got the smartest way, something comes along and is able to break it. So it's not necessarily about identifying the smartest way to design or innovate, but ensuring that you're innovating, you're building in a way that is a few things: regulation agnostic, and two, does not in any way inhibit your ability to be able to innovate at the speed of light. The technology, AI, is moving so fast that we are getting to a place where the moment government thinks they have a regulation in place to be able to ensure rules are being followed, there's a new innovation that's actually come that completely upturns it. I'll use a classic example. I don't know how many of our listeners or any of the businesses actually allows access to Twitter, for example. So you're a professional. This is a classic example. We have rules in place when it comes to how you can share people's images, what you can do with it, etc. But we have Grok.
innocuous, help provide context when you post, etc. But it has a unique capability of being able to edit images. And where have users leaned into it? Undress it. We don't address these things enough. That's a classic example. The technology was made for ABC, has a minor capability, and that capability is being leaned into in unethical ways, such that professionals who have put pictures, primarily women, are finding that their images are being shared in interesting ways. And here's the classic thing. There is no regulation that adequately addresses this capability as demonstrated by Grok. So that's just to set some context. You think you're smart, immediately the technology ends it for you. So if I were to respond in a very particular way in terms of designing AI systems where you have fragmentation in the regulatory space, one of the things that I have found, and I've been doing this way before it became allow me to use sexy to talk about AI, is the ability to be able to decouple your compliance architecture. Allow me to get slightly technical. So instead of, typically hard coding your legal requirements, so the law, the EU AI Act, or the African AI strategy, and the various national acts that are coming into place says you have to do CDE for you to be able to access or make use of users' financial data. Rather than hard coding that into your core AI models, which another interesting fact, which we've mentioned before, a lot of these models are not coming out of Africa. Rather, we should be working on our continent to treat compliance as a separate modular logic layer. I'm using my words very specifically, that sits around the innovation agency. What this allows you to do is for you to be able to iterate on the AI's capabilities, right? There is agnostic of sector, while your legal and safety teams, and you should have these, they're not nice to have. The AI will not do it for you appropriately. Why they are able to update what we term the guardrails, your compliance in real time, without you having to rebuild the whole system. So how does this happen? There are a couple of things. When I talk about decoupling the technical architecture, it means that you ensure that your innovation core purely focuses on performance, accuracy, and speed for the sector that you're building it towards, whether it's agriculture, finance, health, transportation, or logistics, whichever it is. Then you do have your compliance layer, which should have interchangeable models that are tailored to very specific regions. And there are question marks around, should you have different behavior in different regions or contexts? Absolutely. As someone who's been doing this for the longest times, there are rules, there are regulations in place that work in the Northern Hemisphere or even in North America, but are not applicable on the African continent. Allow me to track back to some of the work that historically I had done around privacy, for example. The notion of privacy on our continent is significantly different, where there's a firm belief that it takes a village to bring up a child. In North America, that is fully decoupled in that a child has very private, legally embedded privacy rights, where they can make decisions independent of the parent. In an African context, that changes. So if you are designing a tool that is specifically targeting parents in their ability to be able to work with their children, whether it's schoolwork, whether it's just managing their finances, etc., what reflects in your AI model begins to change. Your ability to then know your market really makes a difference. So there's innovation core, like I said, there's the compliance layer. Allow me to tout this. I advise and I consult for startups as well. And one of the things I see is that there's a typical behavior like, I don't have to think about ethics, governance, and policy until I have, made my first million or become profitable. You're setting yourself up for failure. At the very start of your thinking, you should be looking at what does the law say when it comes to my environment? If you're working in the agricultural sector, What does the local law say about my ability to be able to help farmers or even connect with farmers? And where can I share the information? And not just specific to the agricultural sector, but you begin to look at what does the contextual law say in terms of using AI when it comes to health, for example. And then there's the part around interchangeability, your ability to be able to keep at the forefront. So like the outlook that we're having right now, looking at trends, what is the upcoming law? Is my product ready for this? And I can understand that sometimes this might feel like capital intensive for certain organizations. So how can we leverage being in a network of similar service providers to address this? The other thing is, sincerely, we need to be able to get to a place where we are moving away from manual audits, because the laws change and they are changing so fast. The ability to be able to actually integrate it as compliance as code, which we can break down in a longer conversation there. I have a paper coming out on this. I'm happy to speak more to it. And then something that I haven't heard clearly articulated as much in our conversation so far is ensuring that we are actually working with within the right data sharing frameworks. I cannot say this too much. What we have the most when it comes to the AI space on our continent is the data. I don't know if you've tried to find anything contextually relevant to any of the African countries on any of the well-known, whether Gemini or ChatGPT platforms. There's a lot of hallucination going on. But we have that data sitting within our institutions, whether they're small mom and pops or they're larger institutions like I know here you used to work with InterSuite, for example. But all of that data is sitting with us. So our ability to be able to innovate in a way that ensures we are complying with existing local data laws, and because it is still powered by the internet, laws like GDPR, or if you're looking to work in Asia, the DPDP Act, I can say the full acronym later on, is important. How do you do that? Federated learning, differential privacy, and, leaning into the use of synthetic data. Some have, their ideas around, okay, whether that really works or not, but those are the ways in which we can actually innovate and design in a fast-paced regulatory environment. A final note I'd like to be able to share for this particular question is, I know, Ego, you mentioned the human in the loop. Some perceive that as an immediate restriction in the ability to be able to innovate. This is what I always say. So rather than just a human in the loop, which sometimes indeed can be a bottleneck, right? If there's no context, or if there's not enough knowledge, or if it's just not caught on time. But the ability to be able to design the systems that we localize in our continent so that it flags typically ambiguous cases for human review. So layer it, literally. It allows the AI to be able to move faster. And it also then ensures that we actually can design in a way where we are addressing regulatory concerns overall. I'm happy to share more if there's enough time. I'll pass it right back to you, Jola. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Titi. That was really a lot that you shared in such a short time. Definitely one thing that will sit with me is decoupling your compliance architecture. And, I'm really looking forward to your write-up around compliance as code, right? So just making sure that I think a lot of the conversation that we've been having is really around the intentionality that has to be around, designing AI systems, making efficiency gains with AI, really transforming, your organizations with AI and all of that. It really requires a level of intentionality. You also mentioned something around, legal and safety teams, job descriptions are about to be changing, and people's job titles definitely are, going to be changing in the next few years, because I don't know if on our continent, how many people actually have, titles around safety and things like that. But it's incredibly critical when we talk about AI systems. And thank you so much for that. So let's dive a little bit more around, how do we really make this a reality on our continent? And with that, I'm going to move to Ikezi. Ikezi, you've walked across Silicon Valley. You're a true son of the soil. And you know the local context. So we've seen that in 2025, there's been a lot of AI revenue, real productivity gains, globally. So there's a huge, buzz out there, but also extreme concentration. So for companies they are not big tech, they're not the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsoft, the Nvidias of this world, the OpenAIs, Anthropics, whatever of this world. What is the most realistic way to win in AI in 2026?
Thank you, Joel. And thank
Your
you.
pause.
I know it's like, that's a loaded question. But thank you, Joel, and thanks everyone that preceded me. A lot of gems there. We'll come back to some of those. I actually might have some questions following this. But now your question, it's loaded because the concept of winning is multifaceted. And even in your question, against the backdrop of big tech, I almost want to say that it's not a fair context because a lot of the people here we're not big tech, or are not going to be big tech, or not going to compete in those spaces. They're not going to be able to compete with the CapEx around distribution, infrastructure, building their own foundational models. I mean, with that said, there is still the idea that we can win with data. Some folks have already shared that we have that unique advantage on the continent. So we can use that as a lever to compete in some regard with those large companies, with those big tech companies. Now, with that said, thinking about winning in the context of winning your internal battles with, against inefficiency, or winning within your local context and your industry against your competitors. There are ways, realistic ways to actually do that with AI. And I would say that, looking at the audience, I sort of looked at the breakdown of the distribution of the attendees here. There seem to be a lot of organizations that are exploring and experimenting, sort of just getting started in their journey. And I would say the first fundamental thing to do is to build this bedrock of understanding of the capabilities. So in the keynote, it was mentioned this progression from chatbots to co-pilots and then agents. And I think it's important that leaders ensure that they and their teams have this fundamental understanding of these capabilities, and understanding how you can use AI to assist, how you can use AI to augment, and use AI to automate intelligently with agents. And having a roadmap for your organization to navigate those capabilities and have a real plan and framework for strategic integration across all those different tiers of AI usage. So I'd say that's one. And then you can build, once you have that, you can build in many different directions on top of that. Another thing I would say is, thinking about workflows. I do a lot of workflow orchestration and talking with my clients and trying to help them go from that experimentation phase to actual execution. And one thing that I found is really critical is really not just thinking about your workflows and understanding how your processes are in real life, but more so rethinking them. And I'll explain what I mean by that. It's very tempting to look at a process and think, okay, there might be, I identified some bottlenecks or some pain points or challenges in certain areas. And I can address that inefficiency by dropping in some AI in that spot. It's like a quick fix. Let me just go in there with a monkey wrench, sprinkle AI, and then move on. And the issue with that is that you start to introduce other issues. And I'll give an example actually on how this, on an example where this sprinkling doesn't quite work. So imagine a very typical hiring process where you have human beings that, have an intake process for getting CVs or resumes. Then you have people that screen those CVs against some criteria. And then you have individuals that interview the candidates once they've passed through screening. Now, one quick fix might be, okay, let's use AI to to screen those candidates against the criteria. It's a fairly deterministic process. You can just assign some rules and have AI handle that for you. Now, immediately you start to see some gains. You start to see that you can screen, 10x, 100x of candidates than you could before. And you might count that as a win. But the issue is that downstream you have interviewers that are receiving, a much larger number of candidates. They're becoming overwhelmed now because rather than interviewing 10 candidates a week, they have to make room for 100 candidates a week. And they start rushing the job. And then, there's this term called faster garbage, which I've seen a lot of as a result from sprinkling AI in just specific nodes in your workflow. And so you end up with poor quality outcomes. Now, in contrast, and what we should be thinking, the practical step is to redefine the workflow. So rather than sprinkle, I like to say soak. Rather than sprinkle the AI, soak your entire process in AI and rethink it. And so with this example I've given, what you might do instead is you would not just have the AI screen the candidates, but redefine what it means to screen and redefine what it means to interview. And so that would look like perhaps the AI could have a skills assessment gap or a skill gap analysis for the candidates, where there's a framework to assign a skill gap score and have some level of confidence in that assessment for the candidate. And then based on that, the AI can actually generate some interview questions or some targetedly precise interview questions that then get passed on to the interviewer. And so what you've got here is you've got a redefinition of screening and a redefinition of interviewing. Your interviewer, instead of having multiple 60-minute conversations, they would have a targeted framework for a 15-minute discussion. And then following that, the AI can then synthesize what's been captured from these 15-minute discussions and then rank candidates accordingly. And so this is an example of not just sprinkling in one particular step in your workflow, but redefining the workflow and having AI sort of soaking into all the different steps and redefining what it means. And in this case, the person or the entity, the organization would have strategic precision and not just resume fishing expeditions. And I think this is what you need to see. You need to see rethought workflows and redefined workflows preceded by this bedrock of understanding where you have strategic integration across the board. And in doing this, in having sort of like mastering these two, you position yourself to be a leader. You start to as they say, you become the head and not the tail in this AI race. And what I'll part with in terms of like, what does this look like for the audience? What are the practical steps? It's like, it's a good thing to say, okay, rethink and redefine, but how do you actually work towards that? I'd say the first thing to consider is your data. So it's been said prior to my speaking that data is critical. It's one of the legs of the tripod. It's one of the things that we have that's unique. Not just we as a continent, but we as an entity, as a business, you have your data. Make sure it's in a good state where it can be highly leveraged by AI. So get your data integrity up, clean your house before you invite AI in. Identify a high friction workflow. Think about something that's high friction, strategic, where it pays forward. If you're able to actually nail this one workflow that's high friction, identify it and then map it end to end. Come up with a strategic pilot on how to improve it. And I say strategic in the sense that you don't want to just end up like a lot of these companies that have pilot purgatory. You make a pilot and then it goes nowhere. You deliberately plan for the learnings to be leveraged in future endeavors and efforts. And you do this by making sure you have a very clear and robust measurement strategy where you have success metrics that are applicable beyond that workflow. And then you scale that. Another thing I would say is very critical, actually, is upscaling your domain experts. It's another thing you can do tomorrow. As Nkemdi said, the new coding language is English. And software developers are not, sad to say it, I used to be one, but they're not going to be as relevant in the future. And what you need to do is empower the domain experts, the people that really know the problems and have solved them in the past, empower them to speak the language of AI, so to speak. So upskill your domain experts, get them to understand how to prompt, understand how to orchestrate workflows, and put them in those positions where they can start doing that as soon as possible. And finally, I would say audit your vendor lock-in risk. There's a real risk of vendor lock-in. We've got these major models now, Gemini, GPT, Claude, etc. But you want to be able to swap out those intelligent layers easily. The landscape is rapidly evolving. DeepSeek was a disruptor, but there are more coming. And you want to be able to pivot and move and be ready as things evolve. So yeah, let me pause there. Hopefully that's helpful, comprehensive enough.
That is very comprehensive, Ikezi, extremely comprehensive. And I think one thing I'm taking away from that is you said clean your house. Make sure you clean your house before you invite AI in. And so that you're not actually, and not sprinkling AI, just making AI do one tiny thing that end up creating more work at the end of the day. And then, you just get into the situation of what you call faster garbage. Just creating, you think you're productive, but it's really going nowhere to make nothing happen. Thank you so much for that. Our final speaker, before we try to wrap up this conversation, which has been extremely insightful, Eugene, I'm actually going to come to you and more on the cybersecurity aspect. So as we're thinking and going into 2026, from a cybersecurity standpoint, what should be the single most important bet? And what is one security-related mistake that could expose an organization to catastrophic risk if they get it wrong?
First of all, thank you for that question. Really good question. And before answering the question, I'll kind of give a little bit of a background from my unique perspective and some nuggets I think folks should remember. All the panelists before me, I'm really happy that they all kind of touched on security at some point. So that really makes my job easier. And it really makes me excited to know that everyone's thinking about it, right? The first thing I'll kind of say is, my goal really is to provide pragmatic guidance, not just like theoretical optimism of what is realistic and responsible from an African perspective. Exactly. I would say, number one, governance. We're all focused on what AI can do. And, my take is a little bit different. If you can't explain what your AI is not allowed to do, you've already lost. So everyone is really, really focused on what can AI do? What can it do for me? And they're not really thinking of control. You really need to think about not losing control and putting guardrails around what AI is not allowed to do. Then I'll kind of talk about agentic AI specifically. The moment AI can act, which I don't know if anyone's seen what's going on, but Comet browsers and some of these things, they can act on your behalf. The moment that can happen, it really deserves tighter controls than your employees because, one, you can't trust by default, but AI moves faster. It can be in continuous work mode while you're sleeping. You really don't know what's going on. So, companies and people, we need to think about that from an agentic AI perspective. And I'll say the reality of this in Nigeria, Africa in general, and Nigeria in particular, is that, like everyone has said, most Nigerian companies cannot outspend global AI giants. Like, we're just not there. But that's not really a weakness. It just means that, Nigerian companies and African companies need to be more creative and more strategic. Being undisciplined in adoption of AI would be a disaster. And I think there is real benefits in what AI can do to accelerate growth for any organization, but specifically in Nigeria, where most companies may not necessarily be looking at, reducing headcount per se. They might gain more efficiencies when it comes to improving quality and also just leapfrogging their current stance from a global perspective. Because Kem was talking about astronomical numbers that most people cannot even comprehend, right? Billions and billions of dollars. In the US, Washington, D.C. and Virginia, they're building data centers. Right now, as we speak, the US is competing with China and Russia and everybody else. Africa is not necessarily going to be in that game when we think about, spending billions of dollars. So my perspective is somewhat distinct, but very, very complementary to other panelists, right? I kind of approach this as a technologist, someone who's directly involved in helping governments and also organizations implement AI responsibly, and often through integrated, intelligence systems and automated systems. But from that vantage point, I see two things very clearly. There's real opportunity for Nigerian companies. There's also a growing amount of noise and unmanaged risk around how AI is being adopted. Some of it is really noise, but a lot of it is very, very real. I think a real AI security bet for 2026, kind of looking ahead a little bit, is it's about control, specifically control over data, like most people have said, and also control over AI access, like I've said previously. Control over decision and design authorities and around AI systems and what it can and can't do. Those would be the two things I would say, like the three things I would say are really important for folks to kind of think about. For African businesses in particular, the biggest mistake I would say is treating AI like another SaaS tool or another application, rather than recognizing AI as a privileged actor in your organization. AI is not just a SaaS solution. It can do things on your behalf. Just Ikezi just spoke about how AI could be used in an HR solution, and it's making decisions. So, increasingly, it's more than just an assistant, right? It's almost like another employee. And moving towards decision support and trusted advisory roles for executives and staff alike, because I don't know about you guys, but I use AI to triage things, and it gives me recommendations, and I have to go back and look at it and say, well, this is right or this is not right. But thinking about it like almost like another person in your organization, beyond just, oh, this is another application or another SaaS tool. I would also say that at a minimum, AI systems must have the following: a clearly defined identity from a security standpoint. What is this AI system supposed to be? Who is it supposed to be? What's the persona? Very, very strict least privilege access. What can it access? What systems within the organization can it access? And also immutable logging, right? When you think about logging of its actions, what did it do? Why did it do it? Especially if something doesn't go right, you want to go back and see, why did that happen, and understand really what caused it. One thing I also say is the catastrophic mistakes that I've seen organizations kind of make is allowing AI systems access to sensitive data, right? Or giving it unchecked privileged credentials. And also when you think about giving it access to critical workflows without the right guardrails and without a human in the loop, really being there to maybe put a pause and a stop to it. There should be human override paths for sure. There should also be a thought around, in the military terms, they'll say, a clear blast radius. So if this goes south, what would it affect? And what other systems would it affect? I would say catastrophic failure almost always follows the same pattern: over trust combined with under governance. So from that perspective, for the executives in the room, it's not really about just, a technology. It's about what have you done to ensure that this technology has the appropriate governance around it so that crazy things don't happen. I'll kind of wrap up with kind of saying, from an African specific context, if we got to think about a localized discussion, many African organizations, like other panelists have said, are consuming AI through vendors, right? They're not building this in-house. We don't have the talent, we don't have the money, we just can't do that. That makes governance a lot more important than customization, right? You're consuming, LLMs and other models from the US. The US is not building those agents or models or technology with Africa in mind specifically. They're building it with their own context in mind. I'll say when capital is tight, right, you really can't afford failures that would lead to kind of rework. You want to think about reputational damage, regulatory fallout. Guardrails are always cheaper than cleanup, always, whether it's from a cybersecurity perspective, from AI or anything else. Putting the right guardrails in place are just always cheaper than doing a cleanup a little bit later. Skills are scarce in Africa. In the US, skills are scarce. So skills are definitely scarce in Africa. And that means there's a lot more, clarity matters more than just sophistication. And I think Ikeza kind of alluded to this, and Kim alluded to this as well, having a clear understanding of what you really are trying to accomplish versus just getting faster garbage. I really like that term. I think everyone should kind of understand what AI is allowed to do and what it's explicitly not allowed to do. And I'll kind of stop there and just say, this has been a really, really amazing experience for me. And also I've learned a lot from all the other panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eugene. Thank you so much, Eugene. And I really like, your emphasis on keeping the control. Like, you really can't afford to be careless here. And with that, we're just going to wrap up the panel and just take a few audience questions. So, Nkem, do you want to pull that up?
Yes, sure. So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and we'll be happy to take some more. So please just comment in the comment box, and we'll see all your questions and we'll put them on the screen. We'll start with one, and it says, in building regulation or a regulation base for AI usage to checkmate the wrong usage in our own climb, what yardstick serves as the document to be used, and how well will governance and regulatory bodies implement it? Is there anyone that wants to take a stab at this? Dr. Ego, I can see your lips moving, but I can't hear you.
No, I'm just sorry. I was just reading the.
Okay. All right, maybe I'll take a stab first. So I think we're still in the early days of actually creating our own regulation, and I think in terms of having a yardstick, what we're seeing more and more is that the EU AI Act is becoming that yardstick. However, like I mentioned when I was going through the trends, I actually think that that regulation is very strict and may actually be very restrictive for the African continent. So I think we really need to think through our own needs, and we really need to think through our own peculiar situation and problems, and kind of weigh opportunities versus risks that we have, and then kind of create our own regulatory framework and not just copy and paste, because I think we face very different issues, and we also have a very different baseline than what Europe has, for example. I don't know if there's anybody that wants to, sort of add to that.
I can add. Katie here. Oops. I don't know how much time we actually have, but I will do a quick read through, and I'm happy. Feel free to connect with me on my social, on LinkedIn particularly. I can provide more detail, but running through really quickly. And again, I will have one of these up on my website, is that in terms of what are the rules that we need to be able to play by? One is understanding the sector that you're in. So sector-specific rules typically have a subset, and note I said typically, have a subset of legislation, regulatory decisions, etc., in place to guide the use of AI or technology in general. But then let's speak on the regional level. There's the AU Continental AI Strategy that was adopted in July 2024, actually has a blueprint for all member states, prioritizing 5 areas. Building local talent. You've heard us talk about, I think it was Ikezi who was talking about it just now, that we need to be able to address the talent gap that exists. It talks about how infrastructure needs to be handled. It talks about minimizing risks, stimulating investment, and regional cooperation. Now, think of that as like your umbrella strategy for the continent. And then you have the African Declaration on AI. This was put into place, I believe, April 2025. It was signed by 54 states. So in all likelihood, whatever country you're in is signed up to a certain extent on it. And it talks about the idea of AI sovereignty. Now, those are high level things. For those, fun fact, there's an Africa AI fund, is about $60 billion overall that was announced. But then specific country regulations that you should look into. Some are already in place, some are draft laws. In Nigeria, you have the National AI Oversight Bill, right? It's looking to be able to create an AI council. I'm looking at all the amazing people of Nigerian origin on this panel that should be aiming to be in that. We have in Kenya a draft robotics and AI bill and an AI code of practice. You should be looking at that. Rwanda, there's an AI ethics committee working on strategic implementation of some of the laws. If you recall, Rwanda has positioned itself, just like Lagos, Nigeria has, as a technology hub. As such, when they're talking about strategic implementation, there's a lot of conversation about ensuring that whatever technology companies, particularly, or technology-enabled companies come out of Rwanda or out of Africa can be compliant with the GDPR, which you have heard a lot about today already. There's a principle-based national AI policy framework out of South Africa. Unlike Nigeria, it's not a centralized model. It's very values-driven. And then Egypt is very much strategy first. Now, to wrap up, and this is why I said, how much time do we have, is this. There is a law. There are data protection laws, data and privacy and data protection laws in almost every African country. And these are the guardians, so to say. I like saying guardians of the galaxy when it comes to data that's been produced out of our countries. And if you remember in my earlier response, I had indicated that one of the unique positions that we have is that we have all this data sitting here. So whatever you are building in whatever sector, you need to know what your data protection law says. Whether or not you have an agency, how can you gather data? When can you use that data? For how long can you keep it? Who can you share it with? What kind of consent do you need to have in place? And how long does that consent actually sit for? This is an entire master's level course sometimes. If you're an executive, it's something that needs to be done over time. So working with institutions like AI Collab or working with experts like any one of the ones sitting on this panel actually does make a difference in our ability to be able to compete actively. I'll hand it right back.
Do you mind, Nkem, if I just add something to that? This very quick. Yeah. So, Titi actually did set a really strong foundation. Something I'd like to add, though, is especially if we look at the African values and continental instruments that actually exist, I think important anchors would be there's the AU, the African Union Data Policy Framework, which would be a good baseline in terms of starting. And then I don't know if you mentioned this, Titi, the Digital Transformation Strategy for Africa, 2020 to 2030. That's still relevant. So if you layer on that, like the legal side, you talked about each country having a national AI policy. I think that's a good layer to have from a legal perspective. And then the National AI Governance Framework, which most African countries have as well. So I think by having those anchors and layers, then organizations in the continent are set to have a robust AI governance framework.
Thank you, Dr. Ego. And thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we can't take more questions, but we'll try to answer them on the different platforms as much as we can. So we have moderators on there. Some of our members on there that will be answering your questions. They're really important, and thank you for contributing. And with that, I want to say thank you to our incredible lineup of panelists. Your insights has been so incredible today. Thank you for really setting us on, helping us to think about AI from a position of intentionality, safety, and compliance. And with that, we're just going to wrap up the session. And I'm going to invite Dotun to the stage to help us with that. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you to all the speakers who have and the participants for your insightful engagement. I've been listening attentively, and there's quite a few things that hit me. I made a list of about 5 things, and I think context for me was important because we can talk about what is happening in AI without actually ensuring that we contextualize it to our context and thinking about what's happening in the international markets. I think two of the panelists mentioned that, and it kind of resonated with me in terms of the work that we do. We do see that it has to be contextualized, and not just in AI, but for any form of technology. I think the other thing that jumped at me was the Grok case, where you have coverage of what Grok is being used for. We know Grok for one thing, but sometimes, it's being used for another thing. And if you're not ahead of the curve and just sort of have the governance for that ahead and have the policy for that, you're just thinking of that technology and being excited. So I made note of that, but also about how, if you can explain it. So I like the way the explanation of explainable AI, that if you can't explain it, don't automate it. I think that kind of explain it in a more sort of democratic way, because sometimes when you say explainable AI, most people may not understand it straight away. So I did like that. The agentic AI bit that was mentioned by Eugene was also kind of interesting, because it's the thing that when you go on social media in terms of discourse, blogs, write-ups, it's all about agentic AI. But looking at it from the security, the clear blast radius and all those ways he described it was quite brilliant. So thank you very much. And for me, this has been very insightful. It was it felt like 15 minutes. It didn't feel like 2 hours. So it kind of flew very, very quickly. So because some very beautiful things were coming out of this. So I want to implore the audience. First, I've thanked you, but I want to thank you again and say, well, please complete the form to feedback, what you think about this session. And on social media, follow AI Collab and AI Nigeria. Tag us, share the insights and report with your network. And we hope you have a great evening, and we'll be looking to hear from you on social media. Thanks a lot for your time. The QR code is on the screen. Thanks a lot. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dotun. Thank you to all the panelists as well. And we'll just add a couple of more, this up for a couple of more minutes so that people have enough time to actually scan the QR code. And for everybody who registered, you will also receive the overview of all the trends, the predictions, and the leadership shifts for you to, sort of digest and go through. And we'll also have some follow-up material that we're going to be sharing in the coming week. And with that, we hope that we've kicked off your year and you're now, super ready for how to navigate AI in 2026. And once again, Happy New Year and thank you so much. And with that, we will call it a close. Thank you so much.